Hello and welcome to the Dropping in Surf Show. My name is Rob Case. I'm a paddling technique coach located in Northern California. And this podcast, if you're new to it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to incorporate math and science in the world of surfing and relate it to how it might help us either surf better or paddle better or just have a better experience. And this week, I was inspired by my son. My son basically asked me a few questions regarding wind, specifically some simple ones like when someone says it's a westerly wind, does it mean it's coming from the west or it's going to the west, right? To more complex questions around why does a south wind not affect our lagoon, but a west wind does affect our lagoon in a bad way, in reference to wakeboarding. He wanted to go wakeboarding. So I thought it would be time to discuss wind on the podcast. And we've alluded to wind on past episodes, Scripps Institute studies that have dealt with wind. We've already talked about pressure on the podcast and really what pressure does. Differences in pressure create wind, which then creates swell. And finally, it creates the waves we surf. So kind of logically, the next thing to talk about after pressure is wind. So I wanted to cover wind and why it's important to surfers. And, you know, I know it might seem like a rudimentary topic. There might be a few things in here that you can take away and enhance your experience in your forecasting, in your choice of what waves to take, or when to go surfing, those sorts of things. We talk a lot about wind in level 2, and I kind of broke it down into two distinct areas. One, wind is important in wave creation, right? And two, wind is important by making an impact on local wave conditions. Now, we've talked in the past how the combination of bathymetry and period and tides and direction and water depth and wave height all play kind of more of a distinct role in whether or not a wave is going to be good quality or not than wind. Wind certainly is a part of that equation as well. And so that's why I kind of pointed out that just know that when we talk about wind affecting the condition or the quality of the waves, it's not the only thing. Just know that. But in this podcast, since we're talking about wind, that's going to be the second area that we talk about. So first area is going to be how does wave get incorporated into wave creation? And then the second is going to be how does wind affect the local condition of the quality of the wave? So let's break it down one by one. So wind is important in wave creation, right? Specifically, when wind blows across the water surface, it creates waves by transferring energy to the water. And these waves they're initially formed by wind, pushing against the surface and moving the water upward. And then what happens is gravity steps in to stabilize the water displaced by the wind. And it pulls or pushes the water back down, creating that up and down motion that we see as waves. So this pull and this push keeps the water particles in motion, and that maintains the wave's energy as it travels, essentially. And then as the wave moves away from the area where it was formed, gravity then helps smooth out the swells into more uniform and organized groups. And then this process transforms all that chaos, all that wind-driven waves that you see if you're watching this on the left side of the screen here, into regular rolling waves of swells. So as it moves away from the center of creation, right? So then gravity also plays a role in ensuring that the swells can travel across longer distances without losing much energy. So the force of gravity maintains the momentum of the swell, really allowing it to journey across entire oceans, and eventually end up breaking on the shoreline when the height to depth ratio or requirement is met. Okay. So if we were to illustrate this a bit more, if you were to imagine a calm ocean, right? So now when a strong wind starts blowing over it, it creates tiny ripples, and they're called capillary waves. And those tiny ripples begin to form. And as the wind continues to blow over a longer duration, these ripples grow larger and larger. And if the wind blows over a large area called a fetch, the wave becomes more organized, and then they grow into powerful swell. Okay. So that's kind of the 100,000-foot view. So, getting back specifically to wind, there are three critical factors I just illustrated in that example for you in order to create good, solid swell for us to surf when it finally arrives at that shoreline. And those three distinct factors that I'm hoping to impart this knowledge onto is wind speed, wind duration, and fetch. And so I want to break those down for you guys one by one so you can get a little bit of knowledge in that. Okay. So wind speed. I'm going to click over. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'm pulling up different charts and stuff. But basically, wind speed is the strength of the wind. Okay. So how strong is the wind? And this directly influences wave size. And talking about the wind waves that are created, not the swell, but it eventually turns into swell, right? So, but of that localized storm front or that localized system, the strength of the wind affects wave height in that immediate area. So on the screen, I have a table. It's called the Beaufort scale, and I'll talk about it in a bit. But one of the columns is wave height based off of the Beaufort scale number. But essentially, stronger winds transfer more energy to the water, right, leading to the water moving up and gravity pulling it back down with higher amplitudes. And therefore, that's how it creates bigger waves or larger waves. For example, a gentle breeze might create small ripples, while a strong gale can really generate massive, larger waves and therefore larger swells. And so the faster the wind, the bigger the initial capillary waves will grow. So capillary waves are like the baby waves that start, and then they grow and grow and grow, and then as they move away from the system, it creates swell. So speed, as you can see here on the screen, can be described in knots, which is approximately 1.15 miles per hour for 1 knot. It can be described in miles per hour. It can be described in kilometers per hour. It can be described in meters per second. Or you can use the Beaufort scale, right? And so the Beaufort scale it's an empirical measure that relates wind speed to observed conditions at sea and on land. So its full name is the Beaufort Wind Force Scale. And the scale was devised in 1805 by Francis Beaufort, mostly because prior to this, there was no standard scale for weather observations. So many of the reports were subjective. One person's, it's a stiff breeze out today, might be someone else's, it's a soft breeze, right? So it was very subjective, and there was no scale that could kind of standardize it. So the Beaufort scale is 13 classes from 0 up to 12. And it's classes of wind observations and descriptions of the impact that wind makes on the sea and on land, right? And so going through the scale, I'm going to go kind of through the scale, and it's I think it's interesting to understand this. And then I'm going to relate it to surfing and to swell. Okay, so going through the scale, it starts with 0, and the description of this is calm. Wind speed is less than 1 kilometer per hour, less than 1 mile per hour, or less than 1 knot. The wave height is 0 meters. So these, when there's no wind, it's not going to make any capillary waves at all. So 0 meters or 0 feet. And the sea conditions description is sea is like a mirror. Land conditions, well, there's no water on land. Well, unless it's in a lake, but the land conditions our description is called smoke rises vertically. So imagine like kicking off a flare, that smoke is going to go straight up. Right? So I'm going to go through each one of these because I think there's great value in when we're discussing the other factors like swell production and the impact wind could have on local conditions as well. I'm going to reference the Beaufort scale quite often, and I'll show you some pictures as I go through this actually. So let me do that. I'm going to pull this chart up in front of me, and then I'm going to put on the screen, visuals of what it looks like in the water. So we're going to start out with, and on the screen you'll see some screenshots from a freighter out at sea, and there's lots of different examples of this. This is one. So we already talked about Beaufort scale 0. So Beaufort scale 1. And from now on, I'm going to describe the wind speed in miles per hour, and I'm going to describe the wave height that's created in feet, just so that it's consistent all the way through, but that you can convert it as you go through. So Beaufort scale 1, the description is light air. The wind speed is moving by an anemometer of about 1 to 3 miles an hour. And it's creating 0 to 1 foot waves. So the sea conditions, ripples with appearances of scales are formed without foam crests. And then the land conditions, direction shown by smoke drift, but not by wind vanes. A wind vane is like a weather vane. You see it on like barns or you see it on homes, and it's, you'll see like, it basically just shows you the direction of the wind. And so it's saying here that the wind vane won't move. It won't change. Beaufort scale 2 is called a light breeze. It's about 4 to 7 miles per hour. The waves that it creates is about 1 to 2 feet. And the description is small wavelets, still short, but more pronounced. Crests have a glassy appearance, but do not break. Okay. On land, wind is felt on the face. Leaves rustle. Wind vanes are moved by the wind. So now the things that are on top of the barns and on top of homes, it moves a little bit, right? So that's Beaufort scale 2. And you got a visual on the screen here if you are watching. Beaufort scale 3 is a gentle breeze. Oh, isn't that nice? Gentle breeze is about 8 to 12 miles per hour. So start to associate what you see on Surfline or whatever surf report you're seeing, and what you think, because it's going to affect the local conditions as well. So right now we're just thinking about wind that's way out in sea in the middle of the ocean, but it's the same Beaufort scale no matter if it's near land or if it's out in the middle of the ocean. So 8 to 12 miles per hour. This generates wave heights of 2 to 3.5 feet. And the description at sea is large wavelets. Crests begin to break. Foam of glassy appearance. Perhaps scattered white horses. Not really sure what that is, but it's probably just tiny bit of white capping here and there, but not anything major. Land conditions, leaves and small twigs in constant motion. Light flags are extended. So I often will, as I come into the neighborhood, look at one of the flags up by the community center, and it's a pretty heavy flag. And, in a gentle breeze at 8 to 12 miles an hour, it might be starting to fluff out a little bit, but won't be 90 degrees. It won't be blowing like really hard. Not until we get to Beaufort scale number 4. Number 4 is called the moderate breeze, and that's about 13 to 16 miles an hour. That creates 3 to 5 or 6 foot waves, or 3.5 to 6 foot waves. Sorry, I read that wrong. 3.5 to 6 foot waves. Sea conditions, small waves become longer, fairly frequent white horses. So white horses, when I read this, it's like white capping. It's white capping at the top. So land conditions, it raises dust in loose paper, small branches moved. And honestly, that's when, a heavier flag will start to almost be 90 degrees to the flagpole. Now, Beaufort scale number 5, remember we're not quite halfway through this, is called a fresh breeze. It's a fresh breeze. Still, the names are so funny. It's like, it's a fresh breeze. But a fresh breeze is actually pretty strong. It's 19 to 24 miles per hour. It creates 6 to 9 foot wave heights. The sea conditions, moderate waves taking more pronounced long form. Many white horses are formed. Chance of some spray. So this is definitely more white capping. I'll show you some different pictures in a bit when we get through this. Land conditions, small trees in leaf begin to sway. So the trees start to sway a bit here. Crested wavelets form on inland waters. All right, that's a fresh breeze. I think that's pretty strong, actually. Now, Beaufort scale number 6 is a strong breeze. Okay, this is where we start to get into some really good wind speeds. We're talking 25 to 31 miles an hour, 9 to 13 foot wave heights. Large waves begin to form. The white foam crests and are more extensive everywhere. Probably some spray. Right, so this is creating much larger waves. Certainly much larger waves. And then on land, large branches are in motion. Whistling heard in telegraph wires. Umbrellas used with difficulty. All right, so don't pull out the umbrella when the Beaufort scale's at 6 or more. I'll tell you that. Beaufort scale 7. It's called a near gale or a moderate gale. A gale, Gale, and that's 32 to 38 miles per hour. That's producing 13 to 19 foot wave heights. Now this is, when they talk about wave height, they're talking about actual wave height if they were to measure from from trough to crest. But, 19 feet. That's pretty solid, right? So now we're talking sea conditions. Sea heaps up and white foam from breaking waves begins to be blown in streaks along the direction of the wind. Spindrift begins to be seen. Land conditions. Whole trees in motion. Inconvenience felt when walking against the wind. You got to remember, this was built in 1805, this scale. So some of these descriptions are pretty funny. Beaufort scale 8. Now we've got a gale. And this is the one you want to get used to. I like Beaufort scale number 8's way out at sea. Not near me, but I like the formation of at least gale force winds. So gale force winds are 39 to 46 miles an hour. That creates 18 to 25 foot waves. Moderately high waves of greater length. Edges of crests break into spindrift. Foam is blown in well-marked streaks along the direction of the wind. On land, twigs break off trees. Generally impedes progress. So on land, you don't really want this. At sea, you don't really want this if you're in a small vessel. Certainly. You don't even want a strong breeze when you're in a small vessel. But for swell production, hey, this is what we want. This is where we're starting to go. Let's go even higher. Beaufort scale number 9. Woo! This is called a strong gale or a severe gale. We're talking 47 to 54 miles an hour. 23 to 32 foot wave heights are generated. High waves, dense streaks of foam along the direction of the wind. Sea begins to roll. Spray affects visibility. On land, slight structural damage. Chimney pots and slates removed. That's pretty strong. Strong gale on land, pretty strong, right? Then we go to Beaufort scale number 10, and that's where it's actually finally called a storm, right? Which, I would think that a gale might be like a light storm, A severe gale might be a storm, and a storm is a strong gale. But a storm, also called a whole gale, is 55 to 63 miles an hour. So, most highways, it's going the speed that the cars are going. It creates 29 to 41 foot wave heights. Very high waves with long overhanging crests, resulting foam in great patches, is blown in dense white streaks along the direction of the wind. On the whole, the surface of the sea. On land, seldom experienced inland. Trees are uprooted. Considerable structural damage. All right, so now we're getting to wind speeds on the Beaufort scale that they're saying don't happen on land all that often. But they happen out at sea a lot more. And as surfers, we kind of want it happening out at sea. Beaufort scale number 11, a violent storm. They don't have any other names for this. It's just called violent storm. And we're talking 64 to 72 miles per hour wind speeds on an anemometer. It's 37 to 52 foot wave heights. It says exceptionally high waves. Small and medium-sized ships might be for a long time lost to view behind the waves. Sea is covered with long white patches of foam, and it goes on. Everywhere there's spindrift and spray. Land conditions very rarely experienced, accompanied by widespread damage. And then finally you have Beaufort scale number 12. It's called a hurricane. Hurricane is greater than 72 miles an hour. Greater than 72 miles an hour. Greater than 52 feet wave heights. The air is filled with foam and spray. Sea is completely white with driving spray. Visibility very seriously affected. Wow, that's pretty strong. Right. Some alternative pictures here. Here's another kind of image showing from Beaufort scale 1 where it's pretty calm all the way to 12. I think these pictures are a little bit better because they show you the progression of the sea and the waves and the white cresting. And then you can also see kind of a better picture of the wave heights that you have here. But man, oh man, that's a lot. That's a lot. Here's another kind of view of it that I had up on the screen. This is more illustrative. So really calm. And then as it goes down, you can see more and more breezes and more wavelets and spindrift and such. But the descriptions are all standard, right? All these descriptions are standard. And so that's the Beaufort scale for you. And that's kind of what you need to know, because I'm going to be I'm going to be referencing the Beaufort scale from here on out when it comes to wind speed. Wind speed, very important. So for good swell production, so let's relate this back. For good swell production, generally, the absolute minimum Beaufort scale should be a 6. This is a strong breeze. Right, we're talking 25 to 31 mile an hour winds for a system. But you really kind of want to look for storms that have a Beaufort scale of 7 or higher, right, to produce strong swell. Obviously, the strong, as we talked about it, the stronger the wind speed, the bigger the wave production, and therefore that energy is going to get transferred to the swell. However, the wind speed needs to be combined with the other two factors to create consistent high-quality swell. Right? So the more you have of each of these factors, the better and bigger and more powerful the swell will be. But certain combination of these factors will produce rideable waves, but the quality and power band will vary more when, for example, only 2 of the 3 factors are solid and the third is so-so, right? So you can have 2 of the 3 factors be pretty solid and 1 not so great, and you'll still get waves. It just will be a little less consistent. It won't last as long. So we really do need to learn about these other 2 factors. So the next factor is duration, wind duration. This describes how long the wind blows over the surface of the water, okay? So we look at the Beaufort scale. That's going to give us the wind speed. Duration is, okay, well, if it is a gale moving at 39 to 46 miles an hour, how long in time, meaning minutes, hours, days, does that gale blow in the same consistent direction, right? So how long the wind keeps blowing in a consistent direction influences the development of swell. So for example, if you just have a brief, strong gust of wind, it won't have as big of an impact as a consistent strong wind, right? The longer the wind blows in a particular direction, the more energy it imparts to the water, allowing waves to grow in height and wavelength and swell. Right? So you've got wind speed and you've got duration in time over a certain direction. And then the last condition, the last factor that plays a huge role is called fetch. Just like, fetch the ball, Fido, right? That's fetch. And this is the distance over which the wind blows in a consistent direction. In distance, meaning in nautical miles traditionally, but it could be in miles or kilometers. So, fetch is the distance over which the wind blows uninterrupted in a single direction. All right, so if it's blowing a gale over 8 hours over 10 nautical miles, that's pretty good. We want that. Over 200 nautical miles, that's amazing, right? We really want that. Right? The larger fetch gives the wind more time and more space to transfer its energy to the water. And that creates bigger and more organized wave patterns. It's terrible if you're out at sea and you're in one of those, but it's fantastic for swell production. For example, wind blowing over a vast ocean expanse will produce larger swells than those blowing over a small lake or a lagoon like mine. And I've been watching water and wind on water my whole life in my backyard, right? And I've seen little capillary waves grow into bigger waves and then produce almost like swells. But the fetch is very limited. It's only like, 800 meters long, maybe 1,000 meters. It's probably 1,000 meters long, right? But if you had something that is nautical miles long, you're talking 5, 10 nautical miles long, and it's blowing strong over that, it's going to create bigger and better swells. So we have wind speed, wind duration, and fetch. That if all three are large in magnitude, the swell produced from this will be big, it'll be powerful, and it'll be consistent. So another way, just to kind of think while you're listening, imagine it like this. So if wind is a painter, okay, speed is the thickness of the brush. Duration is the number of strokes that's taken. And fetch is the size of the canvas. So the right combination of all three of these creates a bigger and more powerful masterpiece. So fast winds, gale force or above over a long duration, 8 hours or more generally, over a long fetch, 10 nautical miles or more, creates good solid swell to surf when it arrives at our shorelines. Right? So remember when I said you can have 2 of the 3 be solid and still get waves? For example, let's say there was a strong gale, 47 to 54 miles an hour, blowing for 12 hours, right? But only blowing in the same direction for 2 nautical miles. Right? So that'll produce swell for sure. But it may be short-lived or maybe inconsistent when it arrives at your shoreline, or it may not last long, short-lived. Right? But you're really looking for all 3 factors for the best swell event arriving at shoreline. And then once it arrives at your shoreline, the direction, the refraction of it, the local conditions play a huge role in the quality of the surf, the peel, the surface conditions, so on and so forth. So that's, once the swell arrives, that's where wind will play another role. In the local conditions of when that swell arrives, will the local wind conditions help or hurt the quality of the waves we want to ride? And that's kind of like that second category of wind importance that I want us to talk about, right? So here, I first thought that you're probably already thinking like, whether the wind is offshore, onshore, sideshore, which certainly plays a role. Direction but how the local winds act around obstacles like hills or bluffs, trees, etc. And also the local wind speed and duration on the ocean's surface plays a huge role in the quality of the surf that you end up getting. So I looked at this in two categories, kind of two subcategories. One is the wind direction, if it's onshore, offshore, sideshore, and how the direction may change with various obstacles in its way. You may not have thought that wind direction changes when, say, an obstacle like a hill or a valley or a bluff gets in the way. Right? And then the second kind of subcategory to local condition winds, I wanted to talk about wind speed and duration as well. Wind speed of the wind speed affecting the wave given the direction, the surrounding surface conditions of the wind speed and the duration. The speed changes around obstacles. Speed actually changes when it goes around obstacles as well because of the pressure differentials. All right, so those are the things that I'd like us to explore a little bit. So first, looking at wind direction, we have offshore, we have onshore, and some version of sideshore. So offshore wind described as moving in the opposite direction of the wave propagation direction. I think we all know what that is. As the wave moves in and breaks, the wind is moving in the opposite direction. And a lot of people describe offshore as moving from land to sea. Even the books say, oh, it's land to sea. But that's from a surfer's perspective, that's not always the case because wind direction can actually change around various obstacles locally. And sometimes the wind direction that hits the wave itself, when it finally hits the wave, isn't from land to sea. It could be at a slight angle off of that. So technically, it might be swinging around a rock formation or a bluff or a house even, and it hits the wave at a certain point, and it's technically offshore, but it's not from land to sea. It's at an off angle. It's semantics, but I just thought the definition of offshore and onshore from land to sea, sea to land, is not quite accurate from a surfer's perspective. So mornings often have offshore winds due to the temperature difference between land and sea. I'm just pulling up. Here we go. This is the one we want. I'm pulling up a visual of land and sea, and it shows the movement of warm and cool air. So I'll describe it here. So water's not a great conductor of heat, and so there's often a stark difference between the water temperatures and the land temperatures throughout the day. So for example, in the early mornings or at night, cooler air over land, it swoops out to sea as the warmer air over the ocean rises up, and that's the bottom one that you see here if you're watching this. So this cool air kind of flows out to the sea, and because water's not a great insulator of heat or conductor of heat, that any heat that comes out of the sea, it rises up. So warm air rises, right? And so this creates this high pressure moving to low pressure from land to sea, and therefore offshore winds. And once the land then heats up, which is the top visual here, once that land heats up with the sun, as the sun rises and it continues to rise throughout the day, the warmer air now ascends, and the cool air from the ocean now swoops in, and it creates the high to low pressure differential, and wind goes onshore. So that air rises up, and the cooler air from the sea swoops inland, and this creates that onshore wind typically later in the day, right? But another impact offshore winds make is really up close to the wave itself. Scripps ran a great study. I covered this in a previous podcast. It was the same one as the Duck Dive podcast where they'd put the IMUs in the wave. I believe I covered this, but this is the visual I want you to see here. It's a picture of the pressure differentials, and you can see that the pressure drops dramatically in offshore wind at the crest of the wave as it's about to break. And as we know about pressure, high pressure likes to go to low pressure. And so what happens is the offshore flow, the realized wind speed right here below the lip becomes even stronger, right? So the wind speeds increase and the pressure increases as the wave pitches over, which makes a profound impact on the quality of the wave. It holds it up, makes it barrel more, right? But it also, affects different surf craft trying to catch the wave. So, for example, a really stiff offshore wind makes it more difficult to catch a wave when on a longboard because the wind speed increases as the wave forms, and the longboard has a large surface area to catch that wind under the nose and hold the surfer up while trying to drop in. And so the offshore winds add an increase in wind speed because of a pressure differential. That's what this study is showing. So and this might be, a hint to why I wanted to incorporate wind speed in the local conditions, because just because it's offshore doesn't necessarily mean the wave quality will be good, right? At a certain offshore wind speed, it makes surfing the waves much more difficult. And if you've ever tried to surf in offshore winds that are 20 miles an hour, it's really difficult. It's really tough. It's dreamy once you're in, but it's tough to manage at that wave speed. Now onshore is the opposite. Onshore waves, I'm just going through the description. It's moving in the same direction as the wave propagation direction, and as the wave moves in and breaks, the wind is moving in that same direction, right? And so onshore isn't ideal for riding waves, but for aerialists, sometimes they like the lighter onshore winds to keep the board against their feet when they're in the air. And the wave quality is likely to deteriorate quicker because the onshore wind is pushing the wave face down, breaking up the wave's development before the required height to depth point is reached. And like I covered earlier, onshore winds often pick up in the afternoon as the land heats up faster than the ocean. And then that cooler air over the ocean swoops in as the warmer air over the land rises up, creating that high to low pressure system in that swoop. Right? High pressure always likes to go to low pressure. And this is just more locally that we're talking about here. And then sideshore is described as winds blowing parallel to the wave propagation direction. So depending on the actual angle, sideshore can create somewhat offshore conditions for the wave face, or onshore and bumpy conditions on the wave face. I've even had kind of like an offshore condition but bumpy on the face, right? Because you get these really, these larger bumps on the wave face, but it is technically offshore. One thing to consider is as the wave peels, does the wave's refraction change the angle the wave hits the wave? Right. So, for example, it could be quite sideshore at the takeoff of the outer part of the wave, and then as the wave peels into, let's say a bay, the wave turns, and the local winds could either be blocked by the bluffs or could even be angled more offshore in relation to the wave peeling into the bay, making the wave face conditions either go glassy or slightly offshore. So just keep that in mind. Sideshore can, and as the wave propagates and peels, it could change direction. The wave can change direction, and also the wind inside and around certain obstacles can change directions. So all of these things affect the wave quality. This is why it's so fun. So that naturally leads us into how the wind direction could change locally based on certain obstacles it interacts with. So wind, when confronted with an obstacle, it'll move around it, over it, or through said obstacle. And so you're talking obstacles could be cliffs or bluffs, where that wind is either dropping off of it if it's offshore, or blowing up and swirling kind of back. I think I have a picture of that somewhere in here where the wind hits something and then blows back. So, wind hits the bluff and then kind of blows back and almost goes, if it's offshore hitting a bluff, it hits the bluff and it goes up or if it's onshore from land to sea, it goes up the bluff and then it actually sometimes swoops back, offshore almost, and creates almost like a little eddy right below the bluff. So that's just an example, right? It could create turbulence. It could create an offshore wind. It could create a sideshore wind, or temporarily like block the wind altogether. Another example might be how wind direction might swing around a hill or through a valley and turn the wind more offshore in nature to the waves coming in, or turn it more onshore. Right? So in other words, look for obstacles on land that would interfere with the dominant local wind direction and see how those obstacles might change the direction or even block the wind locally near where the waves are breaking. I've even been in a part where I'm sitting on the beach and it's onshore. It's blowing on my face. I'm like, oh my gosh. And yet the wind on the wave is offshore. I'm like, how is this possible? Well, what was happening was that where I was positioned looking at the waves was a little bit further down the beach. And that onshore wind wrapped basically around this little hill and just slightly went offshore as it went around it, right where the wave was breaking. And so I was like, this is awesome. Love that. Right. So this leads us into wind speed and duration. Now we're back to the Beaufort scale, right? Because wind speed and duration is a reflection of this. And, if we're still continuing on with obstacles first interfering with the direction, those same obstacles can increase or decrease wind speed around it because there's different pressure differentials. And so it could be a dominant wind speed of, say, 10 miles an hour, and then as it goes, as it strikes different pressure differentials near the obstruction or the obstacle, it could increase speed on the front part of it and at the top, because there's a difference in pressure, and that increases wind speed. Whereas houses kind of block wind, they obstruct wind. Bluffs could increase speed of the wave or of the wind. I'm thinking of Black's Beach. They have the glider port right up above. Well, when do you see the gliders? You don't see them in the morning when the wind is offshore. You see it in the afternoon when the wind is coming up and hitting that bluff and going upward and creating an updraft, right? And so that's typically when you see. So in general, when wind encounters like a mountain or a hill, it must find a way around or over the obstacle, and that causes a change in speed and direction. So this phenomenon actually has a name. It's known as wind acceleration or deceleration due to the terrain. The wind speed increases as wind is forced over a mountain or hill. It can speed up due to the narrowing of space, like squeezing a garden hose. Right? And so this creates stronger winds on the windward side and at the peak. So the windward side, where it hits. And then wind speeds decrease on the leeward side, on the side sheltered from the wind. And so they can decrease in almost shadow or common area down. Right? And then there's certain turbulence that happens as well, as because wind is a fluid. It's just air. Air is a fluid. And so similar to how we've talked about drag in previous podcasts and in the level 1 online course and on the members live streams, it creates turbulence. And so if that flow doesn't come back together efficiently when it goes around an object, it creates turbulence and it creates eddies of wind. Right. And then you have erratic or variable wind speeds in that case. So, mountains, hills, valleys, they can significantly impact the local wind dynamics, changing the speed and the dynamics. So, and then kind of looking more broadly at wind speed and duration at sea surface conditions. If you have a wind that's really strong, like gale force offshore locally, as we talked about earlier, this might not lead to epic conditions because it's really difficult to drop in, especially as the waves get bigger and bigger and bigger with more surface area. And then same goes for onshore wind. The waves are still quite surfable with like a light breeze, which is like 4 to 7 miles an hour. But once it's like a gale onshore, 39 to 46 miles an hour, forget about it. Like it's going to be really difficult to surf those waves. And then duration plays a role because that same light breeze at 4 to 7 miles an hour, if blowing onshore over the course of the entire morning and into the early afternoon, it could produce slightly larger surface waves and make the lineup bumpy, right? Because if you look at a light breeze, let's see, a light breeze produces 1 to 2 foot waves, right, on the surface of the water. So it doesn't sound that big, but those aren't waves we can surf. Those are waves that are just kind of bumpy on the surface, and that's no good, right? So when I look at for surface conditions, I look to see not only the direction of the local wind, I also look to see how long it's been blowing in that direction at that given speed to determine whether the ocean will be organized or not, especially up here in Northern California, right? Up here, for example, if you have a fresh breeze, blowing 19 to 24 miles an hour, right? That's pretty fast. From 6 p.m. at night to 6 a.m. the next morning. So 12 hours. 12-hour duration. And then it calms at 7 a.m. It goes dead calm. It just shuts off. And let's say it moves offshore even, briefly. The ocean will still be disorganized and bumpy at 7 a.m. Just because it turns off, there's a momentum to the wind switch. It takes momentum to shift the ocean surface conditions around. Whereas, in Southern California, if you see that same fresh breeze at 6 p.m. the night before, it usually by 1 a.m., that gets downgraded to a moderate breeze, gentle breeze, almost to calm by like 1 a.m. in the morning, right? And then it has a full 6 hours at calm for the ocean to kind of organize, and the morning surface texture is not bumpy. It's much less affected than up here because it has more time to calm down and spread out the inertia from the wavelets that were created. So that's kind of how that all works. So wind, such a great force, isn't it? I mean, I just talked for a whole hour on it. It's crazy. So wind helps in wave creation through wind speed, duration, and fetch. Wind helps in local wave and surface conditions in the direction, the wave speed, and duration, right? So now, this is when you get on windy and you start searching for gales and above, 39 miles an hour and above. You look for systems that have gales holding that speed in the same direction over 8 hours or more, 8 hours or more holding it, and the entire system is moving over a far distance in nautical miles, which is, in other words, a long fetch. I want you to start looking for these things on the charts. And Surfline, that's what they're doing. They're looking at wind. They're looking at seas. And that's how they drive that algorithm, and then they check it using the buoy data. And you'll notice that weather systems, they change directions quite often, right? And certain sides of those vortices have stronger winds than other sides. And so look for those systems in that wind direction that head straight into your swell window with a decent fetch and distance away. And at some point, I'll venture on the podcast episode about swell before it arrives at the beach. And we'll talk about swell. And we'll probably most likely reference this episode quite often in that episode. So I hope you learned something new and it helps you go out and get some high quality waves. And if it does, awesome. If you have any questions, reach out. In the meantime, I'll see you in the water.